Good afternoon and welcome on this day when we honor the March Toward Justice of Dr. Martin Luther King. I'm Deborah Leff. I'm director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and on behalf of myself and John Shattuck, the CEO of the Kennedy Library Foundation, it's a pleasure to have this overflow crowd as we remember two remarkable women who shared many of Dr. King's ideals and who, like him, strive to make America a better country. I want to thank our forum sponsors, Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, Corcoran Jennison and Boston Capital, as well as our media sponsors, WBUR, the Boston Globe, and Boston.com. Women in politics today are still more the exception than the rule, but I'm pleased to say that we have some wonderful exceptions with us here today. Women of color in politics are even less common. When President Kennedy took office in 1960, there were only 20 women among the more than 500 representatives in Congress, 2 U.S. senators and 18 congresswomen. In the entire Congress, there were only 4 African Americans, and none of them was a woman. Yet it's interesting, some people did understand that in the future, politics should not be only a man's world. Listen, for example, to this 1957 NBC interview with then-Senator John F. Kennedy the week before his daughter, Caroline Kennedy, was born.
Senator, you're an extremely expectant father at this point. I believe that your first baby is due to be born on Wednesday, and I wonder if I can ask you a rather personal question.
Well, sometime this week, I hope. I don't know whether
sometime this week. If you were to have a son, would you encourage a political career for him?
Yes, and I hope if I had a daughter, I might encourage her to play some part. I don't think this should be confined to men only, but I would definitely. I would hope he would grow up to be, if not a politician in the sense of devoting all of his time, I would hope that whatever he did do, that he would have some sense of responsibility for what went on.
Do you hope it's going to be a boy or a girl?
Oh, well, I don't care really, Maudlin. Whatever it is, I'd be delighted.
For decades to come, as our panelists can tell you, it was hard for an African-American woman politician to get taken seriously. But 2 women helped to change that, and we're going to learn about them today. I hope you all have the bios we distributed, which should offer some basic background information. Shirley Chisholm was the first African-American woman elected to Congress. That was in 1968, and she was re-elected 6 times until she retired from public office in 1983. With her slogan, "Unbought and Unbossed," she viewed her role as a catalyst for change. She promoted the rights of people of color, women, and gays, and stressed what she saw as fundamental rights to education, employment, and health care. When she announced her candidacy for President of the United States on January 25, 1972, it was national news, but a bit tongue-in-cheek.
This is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. A new hat, rather a bonnet, was tossed into the Democratic presidential race today, that of Mrs. Shirley Chisholm, the first black woman to serve in Congress.
How do you feel this morning?
Oh, I feel wonderful. It's one of the most marvelous things that can happen in our country at this moment. Then for the first time in the history of this nation, a person of color and a woman at that is running for the highest office of this land. And it's a wonderful thing to know that in spite of the many obstacles in my path, that there's such a large cross-section of America who is behind me and saying, why not? Why not dare to dream like so many of us have dreamt before me?
George McGovern won the Democratic national nomination that year, but Congresswoman Chisholm had changed history forever. At the time Shirley Chisholm was running for president, Barbara Jordan was president pro tem of the Texas State Senate, a remarkable achievement for anyone, but especially for the first African American to be elected a Texas state senator since 1883. In 1973, she was elected to the U.S. Congress, and her remarkable public speaking and brilliance launched her to national prominence as a member of the House Judiciary Committee during the 1974 Watergate hearings. She keynoted the 1976 Democratic National Convention, and years later, when she had left politics for a career in teaching at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, she keynoted the 1992 Democratic National Convention at Madison Square Garden. Who could forget that voice?
We are one, we Americans. We're one. And we reject any intruder who seeks to divide us on the basis of race and color. We honor cultural identity. We always have, we always will. But separatism is not allowed. Separatism is not the American way. We must not allow ideas like political correctness to divide us and cause us to reverse hard-won achievements in human rights and civil rights.
It's a pleasure to introduce the woman beside me, another memorable Democratic National Convention keynoter, the marvelous former Governor of Texas, Ann Richards. After raising 4 children, Governor Richards first campaigned for others, and then in 1977 was elected the first female commissioner of Travis County, Texas. In 1982, she was elected state treasurer, and in 1990 became governor of Texas. The co-chair of her campaign that year was none other than Barbara Jordan. Beside her is Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who has represented California's 9th District, the seat that had been occupied by Shirley Chisholm's good friend and supporter, Congressman Ron Dellums, since 1998. Congresswoman Lee worked in Shirley Chisholm's campaign for president. It was Shirley Chisholm, she tells me, who first got her to register to vote. Trained as a social worker, the Congresswoman has forged coalitions to promote health care, housing, education, and jobs, and is a key congressional leader in the fight against HIV/AIDS. She is co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and whip for the Congressional Black Caucus. And as many of you know, Ms. Lee was the only member of Congress to vote against the resolution right after September 11th. I didn't think I'd get through that one without the applause. That resolution authorized the president to use all necessary force in response to the 9/11 attacks. Cokie Roberts is senior news analyst for NPR, where she was the congressional correspondent for more than 10 years. She is also a political commentator for ABC News. The daughter of a congressman and a congresswoman, Hale Boggs and Lindy Boggs, there are few people better versed in the political and cultural obstacles faced by Barbara Jordan and Shirley Chisholm in their careers. Ms. Roberts has won numerous awards, including the highest honor in public radio, the Edward R. Murrow Award. She is the author of We Are Our Mother's Daughters and Founding Mothers, The Women Who Raised Our Nation, and is on the board of the Foundation for the National Archives. And moderating today's panel, it is a real pleasure to welcome back to the Kennedy Presidential Library media commentator Callie Crossley. Ms. Crossley was a producer of the documentary Eyes on the Prize about America's civil rights struggle, a producer of ABC News 2020, and now a weekly commentator on WGBH's Beat the Press. And Callie, I turn over this vicious and unfriendly audience to you. Enjoy. Welcome our guest, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. What a way to celebrate Martin Luther King's birthday. He would have been 77 years old. And so that's a moment that we can take pleasure in, that we are here celebrating the life's work and mission of a man who really helped change America. His life's work and mission did that. And so too the two women that we are honoring here today, Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan. And I want to read to you something that Martin Luther King said was so appropriate in, I think, reference to those two women and their work. The hope of a secure and livable world lies with disciplined nonconformists who are dedicated to justice, peace, and brotherhood. And if there were ever two women dedicated to justice, peace, and brotherhood, and who themselves were disciplined nonconformists, those two would be Barbara Jordan and Shirley Chisholm. We know about some of the commonalities between the two, the first that they achieved in the political arena. In preparing for today, I was curious about were there other commonalities between the two women. And so I found a couple. One that I am most proud to say to this group, they were both members of the great and wonderful public service sorority Delta Sigma Theta, of which I am also a member. Both of them played prominent roles at Democratic national conventions, as you have seen Barbara Jordan there. Both of them have speeches that have been named one of the 100 best speeches in the 20th century by 137 scholars from Wisconsin and from Texas. And you should hear those speeches if you have not. Shirley Chisholm's Equal Rights Amendment speech in support of that is wonderful. And of course, Barbara Jordan, the impeachment hearings for Nixon, and then the Democratic National Convention keynote speech. Please look them up. Watch all of them. They're just fabulous. And finally, both of them, after leaving Congress, spent their lives working for the very issues that they thought important in Congress. And they continued to do that up until their deaths. And so we are fortunate today to have women on this stage who knew these women as real people, not just as the icons that many of us have come to know them. And I want to spend some time this afternoon allowing these women who knew both Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan, flesh to flesh, if you will, to talk about who they were as women and as great Americans. I'm going to begin with Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who was encouraged to register to vote by one Shirley Chisholm. Please tell us the story of first meeting her.
Thank you very much. And let me just say that I cannot think of two women who deserve the type of recognition and the type of credit for exemplifying the struggle that Dr. King mounted on behalf of this country and the world than Barbara Jordan and Shirley Chisholm. So today is really an unbelievable day in terms of the history of our country. Shirley Chisholm came to my college. Actually, I was the president of the Black Student Union at Mills College in Oakland, California. I was a single mother raising two small children, large afro, on public assistance, and one who believed that I could do something to make a difference in this world and in my community. But of course, coming from the Bay Area, I considered myself a revolutionary and didn't believe that partisan politics could do much, just like many young people now. And so as president of the Black Student Union, we invited Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm to come speak. Now, of course, I had a course during that time in government where I was required to do field work, and Mills is great for making sure that we have the internships and field work placements connected with our courses. So my field work was to work in a presidential campaign in one of the primaries. And I told my professor, Dr. Mullins, I said, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to flunk this class. It will be the first class that I will have flunked, but there's no way I can work for any of these candidates that don't reflect what I think a candidate should reflect and who should be in the White House, who would care about and be concerned about and work for real social, political, and economic change. And so I'm just not going to participate. And I was prepared to flunk the class. So as president of the Black Student Union, again, we invited Congresswoman Chisholm to Mills campus. And lo and behold, during her talk, she said she was running for president. Well, this shocked me because I had not known this, first of all. And secondly, I thought about this class I was taking, and I went up to Mrs. Chisholm later, and I said, well, you know, Mrs. Chisholm, I have this course in government, and I'm about ready to flunk it. But after listening to you, maybe I'll get involved. Tell me what to do, how to do it, and I really believe in what you say. You say you're a catalyst for change. You say you're unbought and unbossed. You care about issues of equality and justice for women and people of color. So I told her what I thought, and she looked at me, and she says, quite frankly, my dear, first thing you must do is register to vote. And the second thing she said is, I don't have a lot of money for my campaign. This is a non-traditional presidential campaign. So if you believe in me, if you believe in what I stand for, then you will make it happen at the local level. I said, oh my God, I don't know what I'm doing. So I went back and talked to my professor. She said, okay, well, you have the class here. We can help. I met then Sandre Swanson, Wilson Riles Jr., and Sandy Gaines, who was president of the student body at Mills College. We all got together, and we ended up organizing the Northern California Shirley Chisholm presidential primary campaign out of my class. Alameda County is where Oakland is. We took 10% of the vote in the primary, and I got an A in the class.
From registering to vote to a congressperson yourself, that's pretty good. Governor Richards, Barbara Jordan supported you in your campaign against then Governor George Bush. And he said, I'm going to quote him, she blew me off the podium. She generated a hurricane, and I didn't know what to do. So I'm wondering if you can share with us just what that woman behind the hurricane, behind the stentorian voice is all about, who she was.
Barbara Jordan and I were good friends for many years. We were friends other than being political friends. We sat together at the Lady Longhorn basketball games at the University of Texas. And Barbara was a big fan of the game, and I still am, and still go to the games when I'm at home. I think the interesting thing about Barbara Jordan that is seldom said, because the persona of Barbara gets lost in this enormous image of this stentorian way of speaking, of her obvious intellect, but very few people really realize that Barbara Jordan was a good politician. She said, I am not a female politician. I am not a black politician. I am a politician, and I am good at it. Barbara was criticized a great deal during her life because she was not, quote, militant enough, because Barbara had no patience with symbolism. She had no interest in being a symbol. She had interest only in proving herself by her effectiveness and leaving a legacy of what she had done, not just what she had said. Barbara learned to be a good old boy, which was a remarkable thing. If you're an overweight black woman in the Texas Senate and the Texas House, you have your work cut out for you. But Barbara learned very quickly how to be in the back room with the boys. She would, as was the tradition in both of those bodies, to go into the rooms behind the main chamber after the sessions were over and maybe have a toddy or two. And during that time, Barbara was able to prove herself as a person, not just as a black female legislator and some historic figure. And she had a way about her because she had a sense of humor. She could laugh at herself as she could laugh at the situation in which she found herself. And one of the stories I liked the best about that in Barbara was that if you are a Texan and you're in public office or you're running for public office, it's necessary that you kill something. And if you're not a good shot or you can't kill a bird, you still have to show up at the hunt. You understand? Because the newspaper is going to take your picture and you can't be absent. So Barbara was on a quail hunt one year with a bunch of good old boys, and you can imagine how much training she had in bird shooting in the 5th Ward of Houston, Texas. But before the evening was over, Barbara had a bunch of white good old boy rednecks singing, "We Shall Overcome." And it was that facility, that ability that she had, that uncanny working herself in a personable way to the power structure that made Barbara Jordan so successful.
Let me pick up on something that you said about her being accused of not being militant enough, because often, Cokie Roberts, Shirley Chisholm made some decisions that really caught her in the crossfires of what was black enough. And one of them had to do with your father, Hale Boggs. She had an opportunity in Congress to vote for the majority leader, and she chose to vote for your father instead of Representative John Conyers. And in doing so later, then your father rewarded her with a seat on the Education and Labor Committee, which was quite a powerful committee, and as you know, would obviously have benefited her community. But talk about that. You've interviewed both Jordan and Shirley Chisholm, and let's talk about Shirley Chisholm to begin with. How could she balance that?
I have to take a minute here, though, because I covered Ann Richards' primary for governor, and the thing that her opponents were killing was people. There was... You remember that march through the death row inmates that one of your primary opponents had as an ad? It was charming. So the quail, just a quail or two is okay. I won't say that. But I think the practicality question that Ann Richards has brought up, and now you have, Callie, is absolutely true. And in fact, my last interview with Barbara Jordan was in 1992, and it was about Ross Perot. And as you know, Perot was in the race, out of the race, in the race, out of the race. And ABC did a big special on who is Ross Perot. We won an Emmy for it. And, my basic reaction now is, who cares? But he had been, of course, very active in education reform in Texas, and Barbara Jordan had worked with him on education reform. And so I went to interview her. And she said, look, I'm for Bill Clinton for president. She had spoken at the Democratic convention, all of that. But she said, but I think that he was very effective on this, and I was very happy to work with him because the kids needed it. And that practicality showed through. And as you say, the same is true also for Mrs. Chisholm. I, of course, am not privy to why she made the decision to vote in a very tight majority leader's race for a man from the Deep South. I mean, it's not just that she voted against John Conyers. My father was from New Orleans, Louisiana. But he had worked very hard for the Voting Rights Act, and it had been a very courageous move on his part. And then for the open housing bill, which almost caused him to lose his seat. And so it was the closest election in Congress that year, and he was majority whip at the time. So I think that she had a certain appreciation for that, and she also wanted to move ahead in the Congress and get onto powerful committees and move up in the leadership herself, and she went with the winner.
It seems to me that both of them had a kind of practical optimism about the country and the possibilities that could be brought through politics. And the other thing that they had, which some people criticize now and say leaders don't have, particularly women, this may be unfair, is that they were not afraid to embrace their personal power as well as their political power. I wonder if you each could speak to that.
Well, with regard to their political power, I can remember, and I worked with the great Congressman Ron Dellums for many years, for 11 years, and didn't have the privilege to get to know Congresswoman Barbara Jordan as closely as I got to know Shirley Chisholm. But one thing I recognized, and when I talked to Barbara Jordan and to Shirley Chisholm, was that they believed that as African American women, as citizens of the United States, now that they were on the inside, it wasn't about playing by the rules, because those rules weren't made for them nor by them, but it was about changing the rules. It was about shaking up the system. And I can remember Shirley, really after Ed and Labor, she went on to the Rules Committee. She was the only African American and the only woman on the Rules Committee, and the Rules Committee is one of the most powerful committees in Congress.
Very hard to explain to your constituents, very hard to take home to your constituents, because there's no pork, there's nothing you can show for it. So it's very difficult to do that politically successfully.
That's right, and she did, and she was able to shepherd a legislative agenda from the Rules Committee that addressed the constituencies that she cared about: women, the poor, disadvantaged, people of color. And also Barbara Jordan always talked about the rules. Know those rules, because once you get in, you have to change those rules for the benefit of all. It wasn't for their personal benefit, but it was for the benefit of the country. And I always admired them, because that was uncharted territory for women and for African Americans in terms of working within the system of the House of Representatives.
Well, you have to understand that these women had been excluded from the system for their entire lives, and then to be included was an important aspect of what they were to succeed in doing. Barbara felt very strongly that once she was in, the important thing for her was to use the system to the very best of her ability to accomplish the things that she wanted to accomplish. Barbara didn't want to be exclusive anymore. She wanted to be a part of a system that she passionately believed in. In fact, I was interested in the Alito hearings this week about how nice it would have been to have a conversation with Barbara about what transpired there. Principally because there is so much conversation now about the Constitution and the static nature of the Constitution, whether the Constitution in 2006 means the same as the Constitution did, for God's sake, when it was written. And how these people now who are testifying to become judge appeal to the notion that the Constitution must remain the document that it was. So I went back and dug out, thinking about this panel, what Barbara said when she was on the Judiciary Committee during the Nixon impeachment, because I thought it was important in context of today. She said, "We the people," it is a very eloquent beginning. But when the Constitution of the United States was completed on the 17th of September in 1787, I was not included in that "we the people." I felt for many years that somehow George Washington and Alexander Hamilton just left me out by mistake. But through the process of amendment, interpretation, and court decision, I have finally been included in "we the people." And it is significant that Barbara saw the importance of this being a moving and flexible and changeable document to address the issues of the time as the country changes. I have to say, though, that Barbara was involved in a couple of things that she got so much criticism for, and it wasn't just because she was a part of the system. but because she felt that there were certain things that were a higher calling for her. And a perfect example for Barbara was during the Vietnam War and the convention fight. Lyndon Johnson needed the Texans to stand together. And the last voice in the world he wanted to be against that war was Barbara Jordan's. And so Barbara opposed the war, but she voted for the plank in the platform because she said it was important for Texans to stand behind, quote, their man, unquote. Barbara was a very practical and a realistic and rational politician. And she took strong stands when she thought she could win, but she was not out there leading the charge when she thought that the cause was for naught.
Let me just mention, in contrast, Shirley Chisholm in terms of where she was on the war. And early on, she was against the Vietnam War, and I just would like to read a quote from her speech given at the National Press Club in 1972. And as I reflect on it and reviewed some of both speeches, I said how relevant this is today. She says, "One trembles with rage to think of all these urgent problems, any one of which by itself is critical, begging the attention of a government which has consistently responded only with lies and deceit and the monstrous ongoing sacrifice of Americans' young men and the taxpayers' dollars. The record of this nation's leadership in Washington regarding Vietnam constitutes a wretched betrayal of the just expectations and needs of the American people. I call upon Congress to cut off all funds for this war now, and I call upon the American public to defeat those members of Congress, Democrat or Republican, who do not at long last face up to what they should have done years ago. It may take until November to end this war. If the politicians procrastinate, I am warning Congress that the public is telling you to get off of your hind legs, stop debating and passing resolutions, and prove your worth." That was 1972.
And I think it's significant and important for everyone to understand that these two women were both courageous leaders, and they came from the same stripe. They happened to be Democrats, they happened to be women, they happened to be members of Congress, and they happened to be black, but they could disagree.
Well, and they were from different places, and that's very significant when you talk about something like this. The difference of representing Houston, Texas, and representing Brooklyn, New York, is very different. And I think that the first mission of a member of Congress, as you well know, is to represent your district.
We've talked about how they stood out for themselves no matter what the position might have been thought to be a popular one or not. They just took a stand where they thought they needed to be. So I thought it important on this day to talk about the F word, feminism. And nowadays, so many women politicians run from that in the opposite direction, and both of them embraced it. In fact, Shirley Chisholm, I'm paraphrasing now, said there's so much talent that has been lost in this nation because some of that talent wears a skirt. So I'd like for all of you to talk about why they so very strongly embraced feminism and how that played out in the decisions that they made, some of the political decisions.
Well, as you pointed out, Callie, one of Shirley Chisholm's great speeches was the speech in 1970 for the Equal Rights Amendment. Remember it? And she said in that speech, and I'm quoting here, that it provides, speaking of the amendment, a legal basis for attack on the most subtle, most pervasive, and most institutionalized form of prejudice that exists. Discrimination against women solely on the basis of their sex is so widespread that it seems to many persons normal, natural, and right. That was, clearly a very firm embrace of feminism. But in 1970, that was a lot more acceptable than it is in 2005, which is just mind-boggling that is the truth. But there it is. Barbara Jordan at the 1992 convention again, I'm quoting here, talking about change, because she was talking about the difference between the 1976 convention and the 1992 convention. And at the 1976 convention, she was the first African-American woman keynoter. My mother was the first woman to chair a political convention that year. So it was still very new, all of that. And by 92, she was saying one overdue change already underway is the number of women challenging the councils of political power dominated by white male policymakers. That horizon is limitless. What we see today is simply a dress rehearsal for the day and time we meet in convention to nominate Madam President. Now, I would prefer to say it with her voice. So I think that she was reminding people those 22 years after Shirley Chisholm's speech, that this was, even though the Equal Rights Amendment was dead, that this was still a goal that women particularly, but the members of that convention needed to embrace. And it had become a lot tougher by then.
So it was easier then than now to embrace feminism. How about you, Congressman Lee?
Barbara Jordan said that life is too large to hang out a sign for men only. And she understood that the potential of America was being lost. Her quote, for instance, "This country can ill afford to continue to function using less than half of its human resources, brain power, and kinetic energy." She knew that our country would never live up to its promise, its ideals, if in fact half or more than half of its population was excluded. Barbara Jordan and Shirley Chisholm had to deal with racism and sexism. They had that double yoke. And as African American women, sometimes they were challenged by their own. I can remember Shirley Chisholm being challenged by the African American community, some African American men saying she was embracing the feminist movement more so. Women, and I can remember in California during the campaign, we had some serious issues which we worked through with the National Organization of Women, because women in the feminist movement felt that the black community was embracing Shirley Chisholm in a way that may not be good for the feminist movement. And so Shirley, though, rose to the occasion, and she said, look, you know, we have to attack racism and sexism at the same time. These are two evils. These are two, where I am a victim of oppression based on race and on sex, and neither one, Barbara Jordan nor Shirley Chisholm, would allow themselves to get pegged into that racism is more important to tackle or sexism is more important to tackle. And for that, I tell you, we learned a lesson, and I think that as we build coalitions for the future, we need to really go back and look at what Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan stood for and how they worked with coalitions as African American women to make some significant strides and changes in our country for women and for people of color.
But I would bring up that she did say, Shirley Chisholm, at one point, that of the times that she had been discriminated against more as a woman than as a black person, which, as you know, caused a great amount of controversy when she said that. You want to respond to that?
It caused a lot of controversy, but if I remember correctly, it was around running for president and being involved as a candidate for the presidency of the United States of America. I don't believe she said that in the context of her being an African American and a woman in America in general. This was in the context of the political arena and the campaign that she was mounting.
But it is an interesting thing to note that organizations and groups of people who have been excluded from the mainstream, who have never been a part of power, find it much easier to fight each other than to fight the real enemy. To be able to succeed among your own inside group is in itself some sort of victory. And as a consequence, I've been to many NAACP banquets in the early days when there were more people at the head table than there were in the audience. And I can certainly remember feminist meetings where, as they say, we would have been comfortable in a telephone booth, but the fights were much greater from within because simply there was no avenue for us to be able to fight on the outside. I think it's important to say in this discussion, though, particularly about Barbara, and I don't know about Shirley Chisholm, about how she could get elected in the first place. And that was because the laws were changed. And in these particular times when we're talking about redistricting and Tom DeLay and the rape of Texas during this last time after the census, so that it was rearranged so that Democrats would be defeated within newly redrawn lines. In Texas, we had a poll tax, some of you will remember, and kids now have no idea that you actually had to pay to vote. I can remember sitting outside grocery stores in the black community with a card table set up, sit there all day, trying to convince people to give me $1.25 to buy a poll tax to have the right to vote. When the poll tax was ruled as unconstitutional, that was one step. The second was that the gerrymandering that had taken place in mostly the urban districts guaranteed that no minority would be elected because those neighborhoods were cut up to be inclusive, where you could always guarantee that the white power was going to elect the people. Well, Barbara Jordan ran for Congress twice and was defeated. Ran for the state legislature twice before and was defeated before she was successful because the laws were changed. And that was the guarantee that the vote would be equal, one man, one vote, that they could not gerrymander, that they must draw the district so that it accurately represented the population, and the poll tax was found illegal. Once the conditions were made so that a person of color could be elected, and for God's sake, a woman could be elected, Barbara Jordan was successful. If it had not been, though, for those courageous people who fought to overturn those laws, Barbara Jordan would never have been elected to public office.
Cokie, did you want to answer?
Well, that's quite true. It was a court decision that really changed the at-large districts, and she talks about that in her oral history in the Lyndon Johnson Library at length, the Baker versus Carr decision. But I think that is something that people do forget, is that the laws were changed both in terms of women's rights without the Equal Rights Amendment. The big change, of course, was the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, where the words "and sex" were added to the amendment, the Title VII, which prohibited discrimination in employment, and it said on the basis of race, national origin, or creed. And Judge Smith, the chairman of the Rules Committee, put in the words "and sex" to kill the bill. And he figured, people in Congress might be crazy enough to vote against discrimination on the basis of race, but they certainly wouldn't be crazy enough to vote against discrimination on the basis of sex. And a couple of brave women kept it in the bill, a Democrat in the House and a Republican in the Senate. And I was listening to the Johnson tapes the other day of the signing of the day that it passed in the House of Representatives. And he's on the phone getting the news from the House. And he says, "Is there anything in there that to worry about?" And he's told, "Oh, there's something about women, but don't worry about it." And of course, that changed all of the employment laws and made all the difference in the world. So a lot of these conversations that we're having are in the context of the laws that were passed thanks to the dedication of Dr. King, because had it not been for him and for the March on Washington in August of 1963 and the president's assassination, President Kennedy's assassination, and President Johnson going to the well of the House and saying, "We will overcome, we shall overcome," these bills would not have been passed, the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, the 1965 Voting Rights Bill, which did change everything in terms of employment and representation in the country.
At Shirley Chisholm's funeral, the minister said she stood up and spoke up, and that was very important. And you referenced the civil rights movement and Dr. King, but there was a movement behind him, and for these two women, they were very individual in their courageous quests. What does it take, for those of you who knew them, to stand up alone and keep going forward? There's no movement behind either one of them. They just had to do it alone, really.
Well, and you just had to do that yourself.
Well, I think they did what was right. You know, both Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan were the non-traditional elected officials, non-traditional politicians. They didn't test the way the wind was blowing. They came to Congress with a purpose, with an agenda, and with a mission. They came to Congress to lead, and I think the majority of the American people were with them. Oftentimes we don't see the movements taking place because people, for whatever reason, are bogged down with whatever. But I believe when you look at the legislation that Barbara Jordan and Shirley Chisholm sponsored or co-sponsored, whether it was for domestic workers receiving minimum wages and benefits, whether it was inclusion, and a lot of people don't know this, but Barbara Jordan and Shirley Chisholm were very supportive and wanted to see immigrant rights, the rights of immigrants included. Barbara Jordan was responsible for including the rights of Mexican Americans in the Voting Rights Act. Amazing. African American woman. Shirley Chisholm spoke fluent Spanish. I watched her engage crowds that could not speak English. And so these women knew the American people. They knew what the needs were. They spoke out and worked for those who had been shut out of the system. And so while there may not have been a visible political movement behind them, I think they had the people with them because they did what was right. And that is what's so important, I think, with elected officials, with people who are working in whatever capacity, that when those moments come, you have to seize the opportunity, seize the time, and help move the agenda forward that helps shape a better America, and both of these women did that.
Well, but it's also important to say that both these women had districts that supported them. When Barbara Jordan ran for Congress, she had a really tough race against a really smart black man from her district who had been in the Texas legislature. I well remember that race, and it stemmed around that business, are you black enough, and are you outspoken enough on what should be black issues? But Barbara was successful, but Barbara never had a serious question about whether or not she would be defeated once she was elected. There's a certain security in having a district that is solidly behind you. And in Barbara's case, after she had been the chairman of that committee and made that speech that turned the tide on Richard Nixon, Barbara had the support that she needed, the emotional support. She might have to take some tough stands, and she might have to take some, speak out on issues where there was not total unanimity. But no one disrespected Barbara Jordan. From the time she was a very young woman, Barbara Jordan had a confidence that was given her by her family, her sisters. She had an aunt that was particularly helpful to her and to her sisters. And I'll just tell one short story, if I may, a family story. Once a year, Barbara used to have a singing at her house. Usually it occurred around Mother's Day. And her sisters would come from Houston and other guests that she might invite, and she had a song sheet. So just in case some of us forgot the words. And I can't remember whether it was her aunt or her sister that used to play the piano. And we would all gather around and we would sing hymns all afternoon long. And of course Barbara, the loudest of all, with the best voice, which is probably why she wanted to do it. But all of you know that there is a bond from the time you are a child that tells you whether you've got it or not. That tells you that you're smart and that you're capable and that you're able. And Barbara Jordan had that. And she had it then as an adult and a grown woman, so that there was never any doubt in her mind, really, about her ability and her confidence in herself. And I think that makes all the difference in the world, and I'm sure that's true of Shirley Chisholm.
One of my favorite Barbara Jordan quotes, "I never intended to be a run-of-the-mill person." I think that's a great quote.
You didn't either.
We talked about some of the political work that these great women have done in terms of shaping some of the policies in the country. I'm wondering from both a psychological standpoint, if we can talk about Shirley Chisholm's run for the presidency. I mean, we have Commander-in-Chief on now on the television. Everybody's saying, okay, that's going to put in the minds of people the fact that there could be a woman president. And I wonder if you might, Congresswoman Lee, talk about, to begin with, just the impact of her stepping out to say, I am going to run for the presidency, and how that, in its own way, began to change people's perspective about who could be in the White House.
Just her stepping out there has opened the door now for others to run. Her stepping out there, running for president, allowed young children, and I watched her with young kids, believe that they could run for president. By Shirley stepping out there, running for the presidency, told me and showed me, it showed African Americans, it showed people of color, it showed women, it showed all of those in our country who care about public service and running for higher office that it can be done. And Shirley Chisholm had that level of confidence just like Barbara Jordan did. I mean, it was like, why not? It's time for a woman. And she didn't have a lot of money. She didn't have a major national organization, but she was very smart and she was very astute. And she knew that she would be seen as, sometimes people actually called her crazy. I heard that all over and over again. But she did not let that deter her. And she knew that she probably wasn't going to win, but she knew that people who had been shut out of the political process in our country needed a voice, needed an opportunity to participate. And she galvanized people around the country for the first time, such as myself, to get involved in the political process. And I tell you, everywhere I go, I run into people whose political careers have been, were inspired by Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm running for the presidency of the United States of America. And for that, I think we all owe her a debt of gratitude, because she showed us that it was not the purview of white males in America, that black people, people of color, and women could and should run for the presidency. And I know in our lifetime we'll see a woman in the White House as a result of that spirit and that belief.
I think, though, that and Deborah alluded to this in introducing the Walter Cronkite announcement of the Chisholm candidacy. There was a certain amount of ridicule of that candidacy, which I think for a woman is the hardest single thing to do, to put yourself in a position where you will be ridiculed. And yet, she did it, and as Congresswoman Lee said, without expecting to win, but for the purpose of making the argument, both for women, people of color, and also the argument against the war, which was her mission. But I think that is the thing that to have that person, the person who does it first, take the barbs, really does make it easier for the next person along the line, because it's been done now. It's been out there. The jokes have been made, the bonnet in the ring, and it does make it much better for the next person to come along.
Do people still remember that, though? When the Commander-in-Chief's television show came on, I mean, there was so much as though this is fresh and new, as though there had never been a real person running for this job. And I just wonder, what needs to be said so that her position in history is cemented as the person that made that pathway?
Well, we can't always. I mean, we can't always determine what's going into the history books, obviously, or women would have more of a history now.
Some of us can find.
But even the footnote is a good thing to have. rather than it being a blank space. Some enterprising writers will put a text together for high school that will have Shirley Chisholm's picture in it. And I learned that you don't have to explain it. When a young student sees a photograph like that, they get the message. They know if she can do that, I can do that too. So it was significant that Shirley Chisholm made the race even though she knew she couldn't run. It's always significant when someone steps out of the background and into the mainstream, regardless of whether or not they are going to win, because it does chip away at the doors and the glass ceilings that exist for us. And she did that.
I think it should be noted that she came away with 151 delegates, which is more than Jesse Jackson had, by the way, in his quest. So, I mean, that's just something important that gets lost in this conversation.
Can I say also, I think it's a very important, just what we're doing today, and I want to commend the JFK Library and Museum for this event, because all across the country we need to hold events and memorials and celebrations honoring these two women. In my district, for example, Shirley died, unfortunately, last January. And we actually established a Shirley Chisholm scholarship, a 4-year scholarship for a young person. I know the post office in Brooklyn has been renamed the Shirley Chisholm Post Office. Barbara Jordan has many, there are many buildings and libraries named after her. But I think at the grassroots level, at the community level, it's up to us, because yes, the history books, may or may not record history accurately. But we have the opportunity, I think, to keep their legacy alive, because our young people need to know who these great women were, and they need to know how their lives will be much better because of these two women, and how they need to learn about how these women took on the whole system, took on the country, took on the world. And they were ordinary women who worked very hard, were smart, and broke through those glass ceilings that many still haven't.
At a time when, thank you. And this is my last question before we're opening it up to you all and who might have questions. At a time when so many politicians are equated with just sleaziness, no offense to the two of you here, but that's what people think, that, politicians cannot be trusted, and that they are, at the very least, they have no character. Speak to the character of these two women, because that was never questioned with either one of them. And if you might speak to the character of both Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan, just to leave us with that, something to think about now, in a way that they were politicians, true enough, but their character was never questioned.
Well, I'm happy to talk about it, but this is an age-old thing. You sleazy politicians can't be trusted, no character, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's been going on in this country since the inception of the democracy itself. But in the case of Chisholm and Barbara Jordan, character was important to them. I'm not sure that is always the case with people who run for office. I know that Barbara Jordan had much more of a sense of her place in history and how her character would be represented as a part of that history than I ever did. I mean, Barbara knew from the outset that this was a big deal, and oftentimes you'd be frustrated with Barbara because you couldn't get her to relax. You couldn't get her to not be Barbara Jordan. But Barbara had such a sense of herself and such a sense of how she was portrayed that whether she was that all the time or not, you would never know it. I have to tell one story, since this is the last question, because it's my favorite about Barbara, and some of you have probably heard me tell it before. But Barbara had a party annually at her house where she entertained the Lady Longhorns basketball team and the coaches. And we would all go out there and swim and have a picnic supper. And Barbara, by this time, was in her golf cart. And when Barbara had first bought that place, which was kind of out in a rural area of Travis County, there was some discussion about whether this was a good idea, that this black woman is going to buy an acre of land down there on Onion Creek. You know, just the sound of it tells you that there's just a touch of an area that you wouldn't think Barbara would buy a place in. And so there was a little bitty narrow lane that led up to this piece of property that you could barely get the car down. And an old woman owned some property alongside that lane, and I was the county commissioner that represented that district. And my job was to pave roads and take care of little lanes like this. And Barbara called me, and she said, "Ann, this is Barbara." And she said, the old woman who owns the property next to that lane has put a fence, a gate across this lane leading to my house, and I need you to do something about it. And so to make a long story short, it took a lot of doing, but eventually I was able to get the gate down. And so I was out at this party for the Longhorns, and I said to Barbara, I said, "Barbara, whatever happened to that old woman that had that piece of property up there next to the lane?" She said, "Well, you know, Ann, it was an interesting thing. That old woman died and went to hell."
That's good.
You don't mess with Barbara Jordan.
I tell you, character for Shirley Chisholm was what it was all about. But let me share the personal side of her character first that really always amazed me, because as you all know, Shirley Chisholm, like Barbara Jordan, she was tough. They were tough. She was a tough politician. But she was also a woman, and she never allowed the tough politician part to take over in her private life. Shirley Chisholm dressed impeccably. She wore high-heel shoes. She loved to dance. I can remember at my mother's, I believe it was her 75th birthday party, she came out and danced the night away. She and my mother danced all night long, and by 2 o'clock, my sons and myself, we were about ready to go home, and they were still on the dance floor dancing. And I share this because Shirley Chisholm had that part of her personality and her character was really very revealing, because she did not lose that side of her that made her this great woman. She helped me in all of my campaigns. I ran for the California Assembly, Senate, and then Congress, and she came out and helped me each time. Well, when I won my first race, she came out for my victory ball, and she looked at me, and I still had my afro. And I probably had a pair of jeans on. I had worked very hard that day, and she looked at me, she says, "My dear," she says, "you know, when I was in Congress, I bought so many clothes." She says, "I just have boxes and boxes of suits. I think I'll send them to you." I said, "Mrs. C," many of us called her Mrs. C, I said, "I think you're about a size 3 or a 5. And I think I am not a 3 or a 5. So I'm going to send them to you anyway, so you can see what they look like and maybe have them altered." And so she was just a delightful woman in terms of who she was as a woman. But she wanted to make sure, though, that every ethical guideline in her public life was followed. And I think that's why she was so good at rules and on the Rules Committee. You know, she knew that as an African-American woman, as one who was challenging the system, which is what she did, that she would be under scrutiny, first of all, and that it didn't make any sense to try to play around like the rest of them could play around. And so Shirley Chisholm lived up to the highest moral and ethical standards that I have ever seen in any elected official, as Barbara Jordan did. And I think, again, in 2006, we need to go back and look at how they did it and why they did it and how they were able to work in an elected body and not engage in the corruption that is so pervasive. And I think they serve as role models to me. And I think all of us who are elected need to look at how they did it, why they did it, and try to live up to those moral standards that they both did.
Okay, I'm going to ask all of you. While Cokie is answering, I'm going to ask those of you who have questions to come to the microphone, and here are the rules. There will be no speeches. There will be questions, and I will get the panelists to answer briefly. Go ahead, Cokie.
These women were obviously women of great character, and they did both understand that they would be scrutinized. However, I do think that we make an excuse of calling politicians sleazy and dismissing them. And heavens knows there are sleazy politicians. At the moment, we're dealing with a lousy situation in Washington with the lobbying scandals and all of that. But they are so much the few rather than the many. And I think as voters and as citizens, we use that as an excuse to not participate and to not carry on the legacy of people like Martin Luther King and John Kennedy and these two women. And as we've all done, we're reading through their speeches, and the part of the 1976 keynote speech that Barbara Jordan gave that I found so important for today was, first she quoted from Thomas Jefferson, saying, "Let us restore to social intercourse the harmony and that affection without which liberty and even life are but dreary things." A nation is formed by the willingness of each of us to share in the responsibility for upholding the common good. A government is invigorated when each of us is willing to participate in shaping the future of this nation. And she went on to say, in this election year, we must define the common good and begin again to shape a common good and begin again to shape a common future. Let each person do his or her part. If one citizen is unwilling to participate, all of us are going to suffer. So I think that message of participation is a wonderful one for them to leave us with, and not a message of just saying, oh, they're all a bunch of bums and I'm opting out.
Okay, starting here.
First, thanks to the Kennedy Forums and to all of you wonderful women for such a wonderful time today. Hopefully, one of the things, of the many things that you will do today, is inspire all of us to go out to urge the Dems to filibuster Alito. Barbara Lee, to you I want to say, major share of mine and of the world, I hope that you will consider running for senator, so we will have two radical Barbaras in California, and then heed your own words in running for president. Second, let me just say to Ian Richards. Ian, I have been a voting rights activist for the last 4 years, and I believe, Governor Richard, your race was the first of 3 elections that George W. Bush rigged.
All right. Over here, please have a question.
Are we on?
Yes.
This has been a wonderful forum, and I clearly loved hearing the stories about one of my personal heroes, Barbara Jordan. I've got a problem, though, and it's a serious one. As we talk about how impressive just a picture of Shirley Chisholm in a history book is important to children, both of color and not of color, I find that the biographies are lacking some serious information about Barbara Jordan. She was a wonderful woman. No, as the biography of Shirley Chisholm mentions her spouse, Conrad, there's no mention.
What is your question?
What do you feel about, how do you feel the fact that Barbara Jordan was a lesbian, lived with a woman for 40 years, is not mentioned? Why?
Is he asking me? Barbara Jordan led a very private life to her death, and I honor that privacy. I think we all do.
Do you think that not sends a very bad message to the young gays and lesbians?
Then go to this questioner here, please.
Hi, two questions. Was there one in particular incident or a person or a series of events that influenced their decision to go into the study law in case of a Barbara and then to go into politicians? And two, what would you think would be their response to the movement right now that wants to, limit the role of the federal government and give all these rights and laws back to the states?
Any of my panelists? And briefly, please.
I don't know really what the question was, to tell you the truth. In turning federal responsibility back to the states, is that what you're asking about?
Well, yes. You hear them saying they want to go back 40 years where the states had rights around education, civil rights, and so forth.
Well, they've continued. The federal government has done that forever. They take on responsibilities, and then as soon as it costs money, they try to shift it back to the states, because that's one way that they can get rid of that responsibility financially, is to ask the states to take it on. And every time there's a change in administration, you see shifts of that sort. In this particular administration, they have done the shift because actually they don't think that the federal government should pay attention to the social issues that you and I think are primary in this country. I'm sure that Barbara has feelings about that as a member of Congress. But if I were still in office today, I would decry the fact that the federal government shirks its responsibility to do the very things that we elect them to positions of power to do.
And I'll just add to that I am sure Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan would be terrified, but also would be fighting against our constitutional rights being eroded at this moment. And also, I am certain that they would fight against states' rights, as we see now the federal government giving up their role as being our federal government. And I'm convinced, based on their life and their work, that this was something that not only they would speak out against, but they would fight to reverse.
Over here, please.
My question is to all of you. It pertains to Senator Clinton, Hillary Rodham Clinton. Do you think that she will be nominated for president, and if nominated, that she will win?
Why don't you do that, Cokie?
I had a feeling that you would say that. I think that Hillary Clinton has a very good chance of being nominated. She's a very disciplined candidate, unlike some other members of the family, and she is a very hard worker. She's very smart. She has a superb staff, and she has the ability to raise great, huge sums of money. And I think that she will be hard to stop for the Democratic nomination, but anybody who tries to predict 2 years out who is going to get the nomination is generally wrong. And so I'm not going to go out on that limb, but I think she's certainly interested, and I think she has a very good shot at getting the nomination. And then the question of whether she can win for president or not is, again, one of those things that you just can't measure 2 years out. You have got to know what the circumstances are that the country is facing at that point. You have to have some idea of how the approval rating of the exiting president is, what the economic situation is, what the international situation is, and anybody who predicts that right now is just blowing smoke.
Congresswoman Lee, you care?
Well, I tell you, Shirley Chisholm certainly opened the door for a woman to be nominated and for a woman to win.
I think Hillary comes from the same stripe as Barbara and as Shirley Chisholm. I think she's a pragmatic and smart politician and an able office holder. If she chooses to run, which none of us at this point know, undoubtedly she would win the Democratic nomination. I think she would be in for a tough battle. All of us who are female and have run for high office have experienced the barbs that Cokie talked about earlier. I think she would arouse an enormous amount of enthusiasm, not just among the feminist community, but among the real core of the Democratic Party, and we would see voter turnout for the Democrats like we have not seen in recent history. Whether or not she chooses to run, though, remains to be seen, and I'm with Cokie. A lot of it depends on what the issues are at the time that she runs, if she runs, whether she can win it or not.
Okay. The general question of can a woman be president of the United States? I think the answer to that is absolutely yes. That it's a question of the right woman at the right time. And the same thing's true of men. It's got to be the right candidate at the right time in the right year. The other candidates have to be the wrong ones. And I think that the period where we were really reluctant to elect a woman is over, and I don't think that's just polling at this point. I think it's the acceptance of women in all kinds of walks of life. And I'm not saying it wouldn't be hard; it would be very hard, but I think it's completely doable.
And let me just say, we just witnessed the election of two great women, one in Chile and one in Liberia, and I think that bodes well for America. Over here.
Thank you. Thank you. To what extent do you think that Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan risked their congressional career in Shirley Chisholm's run for the presidency and in Barbara Jordan's role in the Watergate hearings?
They actually didn't. They were from relatively safe seats, or quite safe seats, and I think that in the case of Barbara Jordan in the Watergate hearings, what you had was the resignation of President Nixon. So instead of it being a political liability, very fast, because it all happened very fast, I mean, from July to August, it became a political plus. And certainly a plus for her Houston district. And I think for Mrs. Chisholm, same thing, that the district was a safe enough district that this was not a risky thing to do.
Okay. Over here.
I'm interested in how the interrelationship between leadership and grassroots movements, and how we all, in the words of Jefferson, have to participate in the Commonwealth. And I'm thinking about our two honorees and how they changed, how their leadership changed over time. In your experience with them, or your view of them historically, is it like King changing and going from equality in a racial sense to equality in the economic sense? Is it more like what happened in our time with you, Congresswoman, when you stood up and voted against the war? If I can't help but think what our country would have been like today if the junior senator from our Commonwealth had voted with you on his side of the aisle.
Care to respond?
We'll talk about that grassroots versus leadership question.
Well,
that would be.
I think it's important. First of all, when one is elected, there's this balance. Representing your district, but also leading. And there are moments where one has to hope their district understands a position or a vote, but because you've been elected, that moment comes that you have to lead. But also, I think it's very important when that moment comes, and when you may or may not be where your district is, that elected officials, elected leaders must educate their district, must spend time with their district, must explain why they took a position that could be contrary to where the majority of the constituency is. And I believe each and every time people, whether they agree or disagree, that they will respect your position or your vote and ultimately will be with you. It's very important when any elected official when any person is elected, that they'd stay very close, I think, to the grassroots and to their organization. The worst thing in the world would be an abandonment. And Shirley Chisholm nor Barbara Jordan they never abandoned their constituency. They were home, they were organized, and they were participating. And where there was tension or the lack of understanding of an issue or a position or their work, they were there to explain why. And I think that is the type of leadership that we need, where elected officials are part of their constituency and their constituencies are part of their overall legislative agenda.
Thank you. I'm wondering if one or more than one of you would please comment on Barbara Jordan's illness. I'm interested in knowing what impact it had on her as she lived day to day, and what impact it had on those who loved her. I just did a double take or a heartbeat when the wheelchair showed up in that video, and it was often that way with Barbara Jordan. It reminds me of a real paraphrase of a medieval saying, "As our strength weakens, our spirit grows bolder."
Well, I can talk about Barbara's illness not with any real intelligence. Barbara never mentioned her illness. Barbara was a very private person. She kept her life private. She kept her illness private. The only difference in the Barbara before and the Barbara after she left Congress was that the Barbara after she left Congress was in a wheelchair. There were, of course, impacts as a consequence of that wheelchair. It made her mobility less. She served on a number of corporate boards and a number of philanthropic boards and good causes around the country. And as a consequence, her ability to attend meetings and to attend board meetings were more difficult. Transportation was more difficult. She was transported most of the time by private aircraft. But just getting Barbara out of the chair and into the automobile was a task. Barbara was not a small person. And when she became ill, she got on a diet. She said, so I'd look better in the mirror. But I think in reality, the weight was a tough one for Barbara. And being able to move, as anyone with a disability will tell you, that mobility it's a tough matter, and it was a tough thing for Barbara. But she was still energetic. She got to her classes and taught at the LBJ school, and in some senses she was even more heroic to me. Because she was able to maintain and did maintain the schedule that she did, and do it in a wheelchair. Ultimately, she was diagnosed. She had a terrible accident. Was found in the swimming pool because that was one thing that she could do, was to be able to exercise in the water. And she was unconscious there. Was brought out. It was a tough go. She was then diagnosed with leukemia. And ultimately, I don't know. I think the cause of death was leukemia. But to hear Barbara talk, there was never any mention. There was never any complaint of gee, I can't get around. Oh, man, it's so hard for me to get in the car and get back in this wheelchair. Never did Barbara say a single word in my presence about that, which made her even greater to me.
Okay, we have two last questions, and we have to do them quickly, panelists, so that we can get out on time. So I will start here, I think, over here.
You? Mm-hmm. I hadn't planned to say anything, but when they questioned about Barbara Jordan, I happen to know both these women. At one point, I was appointed by President Carter to be on a program called Presidential Commission on Educational Programs for Women. It's kind of interesting because I traveled through for at least 1 year of that with 17 white females and myself.
I'm going to speed you up.
But it was a very interesting one.
Okay.
But I remember we made a decision in our budget that we would dedicate the Barbara Lee Jordan Library in Texas Southern. And I had known Barbara because we'd been on a panel together on education, in which we traveled across the country together. But at that point, we did not know that she was ill. And so we set up the room so that she would be standing, and she told me to close the curtain because she wanted to talk to me. And she said, I'm not going out there in a wheelchair, and I can't walk out there, so what I want you to do is do something so that I won't have to appear to be an invalid. So we set up a table where she sat on the side of the table and signed, and we opened the curtain, and there she sat, and she signed people's autographs. Mm-hmm. I understand what she was going through, but she was a great woman. And I don't care what anybody says, having known her and having known Shirley Chisholm, boy, we ought to all be just saying, thanking God that we had some of those two women that stood up for the kinds of things we believe in.
Thank you very much. Last question. Last question.
Thank you, Mr. Parks. Congresswoman Lee, you are the unique inheritor of both Congresswoman Jordan as well as Mrs. Chisholm's legacy. In September, you had the unique opportunity to be the only Congresswoman, only Congressperson, to vote against the resolution to give the President all necessary force in response to September 11. Could you talk about your thinking, your thoughts, your feelings? What about that resolution drove you to be the only person to vote against the resolution?
Well, first let me say that was 2 days after the horrific attack on America. So many people died. The pain, the suffering, the anguish, the frustration over 9/11, we all were dealing with. And certainly that was not the time to pass a resolution authorizing the use of force against, and the way the resolution was written, it was a blank check. It was a resolution authorizing the use of force, and the way it was written, it said against any individual, organization, nation the President deems responsible for or aided in 9/11. In perpetuity. I mean, this was a resolution to authorize the President to wage war against any country, at any time, at any place, any organization, any individual. And I felt that that was not an appropriate way to respond to a terrorist attack, first of all. Secondly, Congress needed to deliberate the appropriate response so that it would not lead to more violence and put our country in more danger. Thirdly, I believe they would misuse that authority. You know, I thought they would misuse that authority to do what they wanted to do anyway and say that they had the authorization from Congress to do that. And for the life of me, I couldn't vote for that. And had it come up today with the same circumstances, God forbid, I would not vote for it again, because you do not ever want to give away the authority of the people of our country through the Congress to declare war. And I couldn't do it. Thank you.
Thank you. If I may. Thank you. Martin Luther King said, a genuine leader is not a seeker of consensus, but a molder of consensus. And I think we have seen both on this panel and in the two women that we've honored here today, Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan, some genuine leaders. Our thanks to Governor Richardson, to Congresswoman Barbara Lee, and to journalist Cokie Roberts. Thank you, and good afternoon. Good job.